that you gave us about how you approach aid, how you want to diversify the criticism in order to make aid do what it promises to do instead of getting diverse for other reasons. But I think equity asks that I give 5 minutes back to Dambisa Moyo, because she was quite a bit shorter than Kumi Naidoo in her introduction. And then a few remarks on the way, I think, called for just a brief response that, well, you can sit there or you can stand up, it's up to you. And then we come to Lee and Bogdan for their remarks. Just your 5 minutes for responding to some of what Kumi said.
Don't I need more than 5 minutes? Look, Kumi Naidoo has obviously outlined a very compelling speech. The question is what he's proposing sustainable? As I said to you earlier on, I think we're all on the same side. Exactly what he said in the end, we want to live in a world that's sustainable, we don't have to depend on aid, that's exactly the things that I'm targeting. I've jotted down a couple of points that I'll very quickly go through if you don't mind, and this is how I use my 5 minutes. First of all, I did not talk about the second half of the book and some of the alternatives, and because Kumi did allude to them, I just want to leave you with some thoughts about them as well, because I know we'll have Q&A later and it'll probably come up. But some of the things where I think there's a lot of scope for African governments to actually raise funding, capital funding in a transparent way that can actually help support job creation across the continent on things like trade. In the book, I recommend that we need much more trade within African countries, and this is a big thing that I find incredibly irritating. Within African countries, the tariff barriers, trade barriers are still incredibly high, sometimes 30%, sometimes in the double digits, completely ridiculous. But also, African governments need to stop focusing on Europe and the United States. The fact of the matter is that Europeans are not going to get rid of the common agriculture policy, and America is not going to get rid of the farm subsidies. We would like them to, because we want to sell African produce to you, but the fact of the matter is that it's not in your interest, it's not going to happen. So we should be thinking about selling our goods to places that actually want our food. One of the comments that Kumi cited, which is my PhD supervisor, Paul Collier's point, that aid is actually a sideshow. I believe it is not a sideshow. Yes, as a share of GDP, people might say, oh, well, it's only 5% of GDP for many African countries, but as a share of the government expenditure, very often it's more than 50%. That means a large proportion of the amount of money that African governments are collecting is not in the form of taxation, whether it's trade or income taxation, but it's actually in the form of aid. And as I mentioned earlier, and I remind you now, this, I believe, distorts the focus of the government away from actually trying to raise money from their people and create this symbiotic relationship, and basically has governments focusing on the international community instead. One of the things that I forgot to mention earlier, but I think is at the core of the Africa problem, is PR, public relations. And I promised myself if I ever make enough money to live a very comfortable life, whatever excess I have, I will definitely hire a PR firm. I say this, and I don't mean it in a flippant way, but if President Kagame was standing here from Rwanda, he would tell you that the fundamental problem with aid is that it creates a more philosophical, psychological problem where you can't breed a culture of innovation and entrepreneurship. I tend to agree with that. In the book, I talk about the fact that if you think about the word Africa, to most Westerners, in fact, indeed, most people around the world, it encompasses what I call the 4 horsemen of Africa's apocalypse: war, corruption, disease, and poverty. Nobody ever really thinks about some of the positive things that are going on in the continent that need to be fostered and encouraged. I make this point because look at what's happening in places like China, and you have to excuse me, but China and India. There are more people who are living in poverty in China and in India than there are in Africa. And yet nobody feels sorry for the Chinese, nobody feels sorry for the Indians, and nobody turns around and says, oh no, but it's because of colonialism. India was colonized. You never hear these arguments. And yet, the whole discussion about Africa, and this is where I find it quite irritating with the celebrities, is dominated with the negative story. There, as I said earlier, over 60% of the population is under the age of 24. We have a young population. As Kumi mentioned, we've got a lot of resources. This should be a positive story about the long-term prospects for growth, but instead they choose to use their platforms to push negativity. I just want to clarify and correct one thing that Kumi said. Nowhere in my book have I said that aid should be cut off in 5 years. What I said in the book was a what-if scenario. To focus on the 5 years is to miss the point. The point is that to the extent that aid has worked, it has worked when aid has been treated in a finite manner, as I said earlier with the Marshall Plan. Clearly, it would be stupid to say we should have a 5-year blanket policy for every country. Countries are different. My country, Zambia, is very different from Somalia, it's very different from Ghana. We do not have a 5-year blanket policy. And I think that people have very largely, in large parts, deliberately chosen to focus on that. Remember that ultimately we're trying to grow. This is not my number, it's a UN number, United Nations number. Africa needs to grow at 7% a year. 7% economic growth per year in order to put a meaningful dent in poverty. We have not been seeing those growth rates, and when we have recently, it's really linked to commodities and the arrival of the Chinese. Gender crisis, I understand that African women face challenges, but frankly, we have a very good story coming out. We have not only a female president in Africa, we have a number of women who have been ministers of finance, Diogo in Mozambique, Edith Nawakwi in Zambia, the governor of the Central Bank of Botswana is a woman, she's been there for a long time, and some of you will be surprised to know that Rwanda has the highest number of women in parliament of anywhere in the world, more than the Scandinavians. So we are making progress, and again, I think we just need to break out the thinking of it in a negative space. I don't support the idea of us focusing on the Berlin conference. What happened, happened, whatever, let's move on. But it's time to move on. And frankly, the reason why I despise these type of discussions is because there is no policy that we can talk about with respect to tribalism. My parents are from 2 different tribes. Too bad, I'm sorry that the borders were drawn in that way, but you know what, we've had a long time. That was 1885. We're now in 2009. I think at some point we have to put that to bed and say it is what it is. Let's move on. Last point I would mention here is that this is not an Africa problem. It's a global problem. And we do need everybody to be involved and everybody to take this matter seriously. Because if we do not get this 60% population that's under 24 that I'm talking about, if we don't give them jobs and opportunities, they will become the terrorists of the future. Some of you, again, might be aware that in Somalia, since 1992, any child born in 1992 or later, so maximum is 17-year-old, they have not spent a single day in school. There are a number of failed states around the world. I mean, Somalia is one in Africa. I really believe that if we don't start to get Africans jobs and real opportunities to significantly impact their lives and the lives of their children, we will have many more failed states. And then they will be in a neighborhood next to you, and then you'll start to realize that this is an important issue. What can you do about it? Call your governments and tell them that it is absolutely unfair that $300 billion of exports, in terms of export income from Africa, is not allowed into your countries. It's no good throwing us a few crumbs in the form of aid that actually are detrimental to our society when we're trying to create jobs. Your trade policy is a disadvantage to us. As I said earlier on, I frankly don't believe that there's any point in having the discussion because I know it's not going to change, but there are a lot of things that you can be doing as individuals through microfinance, microcredit to actually help Africans get on their feet as opposed to being constantly dependent on you and constantly being perceived as a drag on the rest of the world. I'll leave it there and I guess we'll now take the comments.